A soldier's brutal murder shocks a Georgia military base.
We had a deceased service member, and the circumstances around his death were unknown.
He'd been so badly beaten that he actually had brain matter exuding from his skull.
Witness accounts point to a suspect close to the victim.
He wanted to go animal tracking.
My uncle and my stepfather both went into the woods. Only one came out.
She said he looked crazed in his eyes.
But as the investigation unfolds, detectives sort through lies and misdirection to catch a ruthless killer driven by greed.
Everything she said was a lie. Every emotion she displayed was fake.
He went from fighting wars just to come home and die? Like, that makes absolutely no sense to me.
November 30th, 2013. It's the Saturday after Thanksgiving, and soldiers at Georgia's Fort Stewart Army Base are enjoying a sunny afternoon with their families.
Fort Stewart is quite large, and it's home to about 20,000 soldiers.
But around 5 p.m., a shocking discovery at a park located on Fort Stewart's military base interrupts the community's weekend plans.
A 911 call came into the Fort Stewart 911 dispatch center, reporting a body, a male, found just about 10 feet into the wood line. The victim was not conscious, but was alive and was struggling to breathe. The gentleman who called reported that he and other military members were rendering aid. He'd been so badly beaten that he actually had brain matter exuding from his skull.
There was no identification on this victim. He had like army boots on. And so that led us to the thought that this was possibly a soldier.
Police and paramedics arrive on scene and quickly transport the victim to nearby Wynn Army Hospital.
The victim did not survive the attack very long. He was pronounced dead. His skull was badly fractured in a number of places. He had a number of lacerations.
The injuries were indicative of a homicide, and that's how we treated the case going forward.
Because this was very apparently a purposeful assault, first responders notify the Army's Criminal Investigative Division.
The CID, or Criminal Investigation Division, are what I would call the FBI of the military. They will investigate anything from felonies to misdemeanors.
By the following morning, the entire base is working with investigators to identify the victim found in the woods.
Every commander was instructed to perform a full accountability of his or her unit. The only soldier on the base that had not been accounted for was Specialist John Eubank. Soldiers from Specialist Eubank's unit went to Wynn Army Hospital to attempt to identify the victim.
I was able to identify John when they kicked the sheet back. His injuries, they were very severe, but I could still tell it was John. The last time I seen this man, he was healthy, full of life, and to be reduced to laying on a steel slab, beat down like that, that's tough to deal with. Like, who would do this to him?
John Eubank was born on December 15, 1983, in the remote Alaskan town of Mountain Village. John's family were Yupik Alaskan natives, and his indigenous heritage was a central part of his identity.
John was definitely big on his culture, being a Native American. He was always big on family, and taking care of his family and always looking out for them as best he could.
John was never scared to show that he loved his family. He would talk about his family and how they would do everything together.
Growing up in a town of less than 1,000 people made John eager to see the world. So a few weeks before his 20th birthday, he enlisted in the Army.
I served with John for 2 deployments. He was a goofball. And no matter what kind of mood you were in, he would always put a smile on your face.
After basic training, John was deployed to Iraq in 2004, where he served as a heavy vehicle driver.
We were part of the same team. We provided transportation security. The thing that stood out to me the most about John on deployments, he tried his best to keep it cool and calm.
He dealt with pretty much everything that you could imagine being shot at with.
Because John was from Alaska, we gave him the nickname of the Alaskan Assassin.
Between 2004 and 2008, John served 2 deployments in Iraq. As much as he loved the service, he began dreaming of having someone to come home to.
John was looking for someone that loved him as much as he would love them.
But when it came to dating, the brave soldier was in unfamiliar territory.
He wasn't given really a lot of opportunities to date, and John wasn't the biggest social butterfly.
To help overcome his shyness, John tried online dating while deployed. He soon hit it off with 34-year-old single mother Lillie Mae Wells. After a string of bad relationships and moving around, Lillie was looking for another chance at love.
John explained to me that Lillie's background, from what she told him, was a little rough. I guess she was abused.
Lillie would do a lot of pet rescue. She would nurse them back to health or get them back up to par and find them good homes. And that was something that she was very passionate about. Over the duration of the deployment, they would write back and forth, talk on the phone together. He couldn't wait to meet her when he got back.
In the winter of 2008, John and Lillie finally met in person when he returned home to Fort Stewart.
She had came from Florida. He had told me that he was extremely happy about it. Lillie was just the way that she was online as in person.
After months of a long-distance relationship, the couple couldn't wait to spend every moment together.
He had moved into on-post housing, and it wasn't long before they got married. It was like it happened overnight.
He was telling everybody this was his wife, and, he was ecstatic to have somebody.
John was equally excited by the idea of becoming a stepfather to Lillie's children.
When I first met him, I was not happy about it. I fought with him tooth and nail. But I warmed up to him pretty fast, I think.
By the time John came into my life, I was already in my teens.
He's about 10 years younger than Mom. He was young and he was still trying to learn what it meant to be a stepdad. I can understand now, when I look back at it, that he was just trying to figure out, where he fit in the puzzle.
He would make these really funny faces, and there's no way you could not laugh.
Over the next 5 years, John continued to work his way up the military ranks. But his hopes for the future centered on his family.
John was hopeful to have his own children, but on the same hand, he loved those children like they were his own children.
But tragically, that future never came to be. After surviving multiple tours in combat zones, John has met an unimaginable fate near the military base he calls home.
We had a deceased service member, and the circumstances around his death were unknown. So it was our job to figure out how John Eubank was killed.
Army CID initially processed the scene. They found some brain matter, they found teeth. It became clear to the investigators that this was the site of the actual assault.
The crime scene provides few leads, but when investigators canvass the area, they learn that the killer may have made one costly mistake.
One of the persons who was helping the victim told investigators she had seen a white or a gray pickup truck in that area, and that the pickup truck was rolling very slowly and occasionally stopping as if it was waiting for something or hesitant to leave. Very shortly before that pickup truck left the area, a man came out from the wood line. She had provided a physical description of a white male with longish, maybe shoulder-length hair, average build, who was wearing jeans and a long-sleeved top.
That could be the last person who had seen him alive, and we needed to find out who this person was.
Coming up, a grieving widow and her daughter share a disturbing first-hand account.
I told them everything that I knew. I didn't hold back anything.
And investigators zero in on a person of interest.
He had a very extensive criminal history. He threatened to kill her, choked her, and held her against her will.
He was a ticking time bomb.
The day after finding soldier John Eubank's body, military police are investigating their first lead after a witness reported seeing suspicious activity moments before his body was found.
She had actually witnessed a man come out from the wood line, walk around the back of the truck, and get in just before it departed.
Unfortunately, the witness did not see a license plate number for the vehicle, so identifying the suspect will take more legwork.
At that point, staff sergeants in Specialist John Eubank's unit decided to call his dependent spouse, and that was Lillie Eubank. Lillie answered the phone and told them that she was actually about to call the MPs because she stated her husband, Specialist Eubank, had not come home that night and that she had not seen him since the previous afternoon. The sergeant asked whether she had filed a missing persons report, and she said she had not because she believed she had to wait 24 hours before she could do that.
Rather than deliver news of John's death over the phone, military police send a car to bring Lillie in.
The casualty assistance officer informed Lillie that her husband, Specialist John Eubank, was deceased. She simply said over and over again, who would do this to him? Who would do something like this to him? Lillie Eubank's response was puzzling and very suspicious in that she never asked what happened because nobody had informed her of the cause or manner of death.
Despite her grief, Lillie does her best to answer investigators' questions.
Lillie Mae Eubank reported that she had last seen her husband on November 30th around 4:30 at the Holbrook Pond Recreation Area.
He wanted to go animal tracking, so she and her daughter, Angel Wells, had dropped him off to go off into the woods. He had told her to just go on ahead home, that he would walk home himself.
John's body was found at 5 p.m., just 30 minutes later.
Lillie described her marriage with John as a good marriage. She loved him very much. He provided for their family, and he was the father figure to her 2 daughters. She was telling me about how she was texting back and forth with John, and he was saying, things like, "Oh yeah, we're having a good time," which caused the suspicion of who's we. She explained that he was referring to him being with the deer. So these messages between her and John really gave me interest in what was on her cell phone. When I asked Lillie to be able to search her cell phone, she seemed really open to the idea and not reluctant to share that with me.
While CID waits for the analysis, they let Lillie go home and continue gathering information from friends and service members.
We sent a team over to their neighborhood to canvass their neighbors and ask them what they've seen.
When officers passed the Eubank home, they noticed something surprising in their driveway.
It was interesting for agents to see a silver pickup truck because eyewitnesses at Holbrook Pond had seen a white or a silver in color pickup truck slowly rolling past the location where John Eubank was found.
When speaking with neighbors, they confirm that Lillie drives the truck, and also share another piece of information Lillie left out of her statement.
Some neighbors reported that on the evening of John Eubank's murder, which was November 30th, they saw a person they knew to be Lillie Eubank's brother, Carl Swain, departing the residence.
In her timeline, she never once mentioned that her brother had been in town visiting.
My Uncle Carl was a little off the wall. I asked her why my Uncle Carl had even came here, and she had told me that my Uncle Carl wanted to try to rebuild their relationship. Nobody really had a relationship with him because he's literally been in and out of prison my entire life.
When investigators confront Lillie, she says that Carl was in town for Thanksgiving, but she took him to the bus station that evening.
He didn't live there, and so she took him to the bus station to send him back home.
Agent Cicero demands to know why Lillie Eubank wouldn't have mentioned that her brother has been in town. Lillie responds that she was actually just trying to protect her brother Carl.
She had purchased his ticket to travel from Alabama to Savannah and back. And the explanation that Lillie gave was he had some sort of criminal history that would prevent him from traveling outside of the state.
Investigators ask Lillie to give her full statement again.
When asked to now tell a truthful statement, Lillie said that she was not truthful when she said she dropped John Eubank off at Holbrook Pond to go animal tracking by himself. She said that in reality, she and her daughter Angel had driven John Eubank and Carl Swain to Holbrook Pond and had dropped them both off that afternoon to supposedly go animal tracking. That John Eubank had gotten out of the truck and departed with a slingshot, and that Carl Swain had a wooden baseball bat.
Lillie says the men took the weapons to fend off any wild hogs they might run into, so she didn't think anything of it at the time. She and her daughter ran some errands, then returned a few hours later to pick them up.
Lillie and Angel come back, and as they pull around, they see Carl up in the wood line with the baseball bat, hitting something repeatedly. Shortly thereafter, Carl comes down from the wood line and gets in the vehicle with them. He is exasperated, has blood on him, and the baseball bat had blood on it. Lillie inquired to Carl, hey, what happened? And Carl said that they were scared or spooked by a hog, and he was up there beating the hog, and John ran off like a little bitch.
My uncle and my stepfather both went into the woods. Only one came out.
She said he looked crazed in his eyes and still a little amped up.
Lillie claims she took Carl's explanation at face value when it happened. But investigators are quick to challenge her story.
As I continue to interview Lillie, I kind of lay out all the facts to her of, okay, your husband went missing yesterday. You saw your brother beating, quote unquote, a pig in the woods. Your husband is deceased. Common sense would tell you that the likelihood that it was Carl who killed your husband is high. And she continued to claim ignorance.
She believes that she's simply a sort of victim in all of this and that she never knew that was going to happen.
Investigators keep pressing.
The agents didn't believe her. They pressed her on that story. And ultimately, Lillie admitted that she had seen Swain was beating something and it wasn't a hog, that it was actually the body of John Eubank.
Lillie Mae Eubank has just confessed to seeing her brother Carl Swain beat her husband to death.
We knew she was involved, but we didn't know the extent of how she was involved at this point in the investigation.
But now, Lillie is willing to work with investigators to help build a case against John's killer.
She agreed to make a surreptitious recorded phone call to Carl Swain that CID would listen in on.
We asked her to ask Carl about what happened to the bat, to try to get Carl to make some sort of admission.
So, of course, Carl's very suspicious when he gets a call from Lillie. He puts together the fact that he's probably being overheard on the phone.
He told her, I don't know what you're talking about, and that was about the extent of that conversation. Lillie is not apprehended at this point, but was very clearly a person of interest.
With Carl thwarting the attempt at self-incrimination, investigators work with the FBI to try a different route.
Lillie Eubank placed her daughter Angel Wells at the crime scene. We then had to interview Angel to verify not only her mom's story, but also try and put the pieces together of what actually happened that day.
During her interview, Angel corroborates everything her mother told police.
When we were coming back to pick him up, I saw Uncle Carl swinging the bat towards the ground. Then he stopped, and he came out the woods, and he got in the truck. He had blood splattered on his face, as if you would if you took spaghetti sauce on a spoon and splattered it on a wall. He said that he had hit the wild boar in the head, one hit, and busted his head open. I did not believe Carl. I asked Carl to see the bat. He handed it to me. There was hair still in the bat, splintered in the wood.
Angel says she felt like she knew what really happened, but like her mother, she was afraid Carl might kill her too.
I had no idea why my uncle would do that. My granny said that he was a ticking time bomb and he had anger issues.
When investigators check Carl's police record, it confirms Lillie and Angel had good reason to fear him.
He had a very extensive criminal history. The most blaring was an assault against a former wife, where he threatened to kill her, choked her, and held her against her will.
They wanted to make sure they got him into custody as soon as possible.
With Lillie's help, authorities are able to track Carl to an address in Alabama on December 6th.
They took Swain into custody, really without any incident.
The agents then went into the warehouse where Carl was living, and they looked for any items of interest that might tie him to the murder of John.
In the furthest reaches of the crawl space, they found John Eubank's military sea bag. And when they opened it, they found a pair of blue jeans and a pair of cowboy boots that they submitted to the lab.
Carl denies having anything to do with John's death, but results of the forensic tests show otherwise.
It was determined that the jeans contained the DNA of both Carl Swain and John Eubank.
Carl is charged with first-degree murder and extradited to Georgia to face trial. Three weeks after the arrest, on December 27th, John Eubank's loved ones gather for a memorial service.
It was tough. When I had to hand his mother that flag at the funeral, that was the toughest thing I ever did in my life.
But when John's fellow service members learn how he died, they're immediately suspicious.
Nobody had ever heard of him going hog hunting before.
We kind of had a gut feeling that something just didn't seem right.
After the funeral, John's comrades share their concerns with Army CID.
They said that John was very good about managing his money before he met and married Lillie, but that after he married her, he always was needing to borrow money.
We were concerned because of the financial struggle, because of the way he was not associating with us the same way as he did before he got married.
There's a culture in the military that you don't show weakness, number one, and you don't go around airing your problems to everybody.
John's friends say they were confused by the sudden change until they discovered the reason for it.
Lillie took over his finances when they got together. There were a lot of times where she would write out checks that were bad.
She had no control when it came to money.
Mama seemed to be really bossy, and if she didn't get a response back from him really quick, she seemed to get really upset.
And his fellow soldiers say John finally decided to do something about it during his last deployment.
He was bound and determined to get the divorce when he came back home because he had had enough.
All John Eubank wanted was somebody to be nice to him and to care about him. And when he came to the realization that Lillie Eubank was never going to do that, and that all she wanted him for was his money and a roof over her head, he was bold enough finally to broach the topic of divorce. But once he did that, he was worth more dead than alive.
Coming up, phone records reveal the details of a murder for hire.
Each day involved a new type of plan to kill John Eubank.
But can detectives prove who was behind it?
She seemed relieved almost that she finally was done with hiding all the facts.
Six days after John Eubank's body was discovered bludgeoned to death on Fort Stewart Army Base, investigators have arrested Carl Swain for his murder. But they suspect John's wife, Lillie, was involved as well.
There were too many red flags, such as Carl not being included in her story from the beginning. And we're starting to believe that Lillie is a subject in this case versus a grieving widow.
To help investigators prove Lillie is responsible, John's friend Tamisa records several conversations with her, hoping she'll slip up.
I didn't care if I needed to use my cell phone or wear a wire, wear a recording device. I was going to find out what had happened.
I wish we knew at that moment what he was doing.
Oh, no.
So we could stop it. It's driving me pure insane.
I had to think strategically because I really wanted to make sure that I didn't do anything to alarm her.
She tells Tamisa that she and her daughter live in fear of Carl, despite the fact that he's been arrested.
He'll come after me and Angel. I know he will.
Why would he go after you guys?
Because of the witnesses. Because of the witnesses, nobody can testify against him.
The tapes are turned over to the FBI, but there's nothing incriminating enough to make an arrest. When agents confront Lillie for the third time, she admits there's more to the story, but says it's not what they think.
Lillie's story is that she was experiencing marital difficulties, claiming that he had physically assaulted her and that he was verbally and emotionally abusive.
Lillie claims she turned to her brother for help.
Lillie Eubank told me that she asked her brother Carl to rough up her husband to scare John into acting appropriately to her.
Swain was only supposed to beat John up with his fists, and instead he went wild and out of control and murdered him with his baseball bat.
But with all the lies leading up to this, investigators are no longer inclined to believe her.
At this point, Lillie Eubank has changed her story 3 times. We couldn't find that there was actually abuse happening. The investigators that I was working with and myself all found this very problematic.
It's clear Lillie isn't going to tell them the truth, and so far Carl has remained silent as well. But while he's in jail awaiting trial, Carl makes a crucial mistake.
He told 2 detainees in the Chatham County Jail what he had done, that he had beaten John Eubank to death. Swain had confided in them that he had done this at the behest of his sister, Lillie Eubank, because she was going to get $500,000 after the murder as the grieving widow, and that he was going to be owed $160,000 for his part in the murder. Service members are covered by something called the Servicemen's Group Life Insurance Policy, SGLI. Lillie Eubank was the beneficiary of those life insurance benefits. Every emotion Lillie Eubank displayed was fake. Lillie Eubank cared about nothing other than Lillie Eubank.
When investigators receive the analysis for Lillie's phone records, they find further evidence of a murder plot.
Special Agent Fryman found a string of text messages between Lillie Eubank and Carl Swain. From the text messages, Investigators were able to discern that Lillie Eubank had been planning to and attempting to kill John Eubank for much longer than was initially suspected.
Back in April of 2013, she had a conversation with one of her daughters about John wanting a divorce.
We can tell from Lillie Eubank's internet search history, that's when she started planning his murder.
Lillie's content for searches conducted on her phone included how to drown somebody in a bathtub, as well as poisons that will not be identified on an autopsy.
In September of 2013, Lillie texted, "I baked him a strawberry vanilla bean cake." Special Agent Fryman was able to uncover that vanilla bean was actually sort of a code word for a castor bean, which can be used to make ricin poison. She thought that by baking castor beans into a cake, she had created ricin and was going to effectively poison him to death.
The attempt to poison John failed, but texts show Lillie kept looking for solutions.
One of the things that came up in discussion was a trip to Tybee Island. There was mention of John not being a good swimmer, and then so potential attempts at maybe a drowning.
That plan didn't work out. The next day was Thanksgiving, and the day after sitting at John Eubank's Thanksgiving table, Carl Swain then invited John Eubank out for that walk.
John never once probably knew it was coming because he assumed this is something that John and Carl were doing to maybe bond, to like get to know one another.
After putting together the text messages, search history, and motive, we were able to have enough to charge Lillie in the murder of John Eubank as well.
On February 26th, detectives confront Lillie with the evidence. And this time, she has a different reaction.
She seemed relieved almost that she finally was done with hiding all the facts.
Lillie Eubank confessed that, in reality, she had not asked Carl Swain to beat up John Eubank as retaliation for some sort of abuse. It was simply in expectation of a $500,000 death gratuity.
At this point, Lillie was arrested and charged with murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and murder for hire.
I was like, what the do you mean she's been arrested for what? Like, it didn't click at first.
We were fortunate in that we had an excellent investigation that had produced overwhelming evidence, but a prosecutor still never walks into a jury trial thinking it's a sure thing. The defendant really has nothing to lose.
After a 3-month investigation, Lillie Mae Eubank and her brother Carl Swain have both been charged for the murder of John Eubank. But as prosecutors prepare the case for trial, Lillie tries to lay the blame entirely on Carl.
Lillie Eubank maintained that Carl Swain had demanded the money from her and essentially had twisted Lillie's arm to participate in this plan.
Like her other claims, the evidence doesn't support it.
Lillie told us she purchased a bat a couple weeks prior to the murder with John for protection in their vehicle in the event it broke down.
Investigators went to Walmart to pull surveillance footage, and sure enough, they found footage at the self-checkout where John Eubank was actually purchasing the bat that was ultimately used in his murder.
It just showed how just heartless she was.
part of me wants to believe my mom, but there's just so much other evidence that says otherwise.
Lillie Eubank was incredibly cold and calculating throughout this murder plot, all the while pretending to be John Eubank's loving wife. Lillie manipulated Carl Swain's impoverished situation to entice him to come to Hinesville and murder her husband.
Carl was homeless and living on the edge. $160,000 would be a great motivator to anyone in his situation.
Not even jail stops Lillie from continuing her manipulation tactics.
She didn't like being in the local jail, so she would make herself seriously ill such that she would have to be transported to a hospital facility. When that behavior stopped working, Lillie Eubank pretended to be absolutely catatonic.
The defense attorney for Lillie tried to bring a defense of mental capacity.
The ploy gets Lillie what she wants, a psychiatric evaluation. But her plan backfires.
The court found that she was stable enough to not only be charged, but go to trial if she chose to. She chose not to and took a plea agreement to conspiracy to commit murder.
Lillie is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In March 2015, more than a year after John's murder, Lillie's brother Carl goes on trial.
The evidence was just so overwhelming, I don't think there was much the defense could do here.
Carl was found guilty on all three charges: murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and murder for hire. Each of those charges brings a mandatory minimum sentence of life in prison. So Carl received 3 life sentences, and he will remain there without any opportunity to be released.
I think justice was served because they would never have the opportunity to be outside those walls again.
Neither one of them deserve to have a life outside of prison.
John should be remembered as a hero, a friend, and for just who he was to each and everyone.
My dad did not deserve to die like that. He went from fighting wars just to come home and die. Like, that makes absolutely no sense to me.
It began with a door that should never have been opened. Paris, winter 2003. The air carried that metallic chill, the kind that settles into the bones and refuses to leave. On Rue des Martyrs, a narrow street that never truly sleeps, a landlord stood outside apartment 3B, fingers trembling against a chipped brass handle. Rent unpaid, calls unanswered. The smell, faint at first, then unmistakable, seeping through the hallway like a warning no one wanted to hear. Neighbors had complained, not loudly, not urgently, just enough to be noticed, just enough to be ignored. Until that morning. The lock snapped with a dull crack. The door opened inward, and everything changed. Inside, the apartment was too still. Curtains drawn, lights off. A half-drunk glass of red wine rested on the table, dried into a dark ring. A chair tipped slightly, as if someone had risen too quickly. There were no signs of struggle. No shattered glass.
No overturned furniture.
Just silence. Thick. Suffocating.
Wrong.
Then they found her. Claire Dufour, 32. A translator. Quiet, according to neighbors. Polite. The kind of person you pass on the stairs and forget seconds later. She lay on the bedroom floor, one arm stretched toward the doorway, fingers curled as if reaching for something or someone just out of sight. No blood.
No obvious wounds.
her face frozen in something that wasn't quite fear but close enough to haunt anyone who looked too long. The police arrived within minutes. Another unexplained death in a city that hides secrets better than most. At first glance, it didn't look like a homicide. No forced entry. No defensive injuries. No signs of theft. Just a woman alone, dead in her own apartment. But Paris had seen this before. And the details didn't add up. Neighbors said they hadn't seen Claire for 3 days. One recalled hearing footsteps late at night. Another mentioned a faint argument, voices muffled through thin walls, too distorted to understand. No one called the police. No one knocked on her door. In Paris, people learn early not to ask questions. The coroner's report would change everything. Time of death, approximately 72 hours before discovery. Cause of death, undetermined.
No trauma.
No toxins detected in initial screening. No signs of overdose. Her heart had simply stopped, abruptly, violently, as if something had triggered it. Something external, something unseen. The file was labeled cautiously at first. Suspicious death. Then quietly it shifted. Possible homicide. Detective Laurent Varese took the case. 20 years in the Paris police prefecture. Known for patience. Known for silence. The kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He stood in that apartment for hours, unmoving, eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, every object left behind. He didn't see chaos. He saw interruption. Claire hadn't expected to die. Her coat was still hanging by the door. Her handbag untouched. Her phone placed neatly on the bedside table. No frantic messages. No desperate calls. Just one final outgoing text, sent hours before her estimated time of death. Can we talk tonight? No name attached. Just a number. The number led nowhere. A prepaid phone. Activated 2 weeks earlier. Deactivated the night Claire died. A ghost line. Disposable. Intentional. Varese didn't believe in coincidences. He pulled her records. Work history. Financial statements. Personal contacts. Claire Dufour lived a quiet life, but there were fractures beneath the surface. Small withdrawals from her account. Irregular. Unexplained. Meetings canceled at the last minute. A pattern of absence that no one had noticed until it was too late. Then came the first real clue. A neighbor from across the street. Elderly. Observant. The kind of witness police usually dismiss, until they don't. She remembered a man.
Tall.
Dark coat. Face partially hidden by a scarf. He had been standing outside Claire's building 2 nights before her body was found. Not moving. Not smoking. Just watching. For hours. No one else saw him. No cameras caught him.
No trace.
But the witness was certain. He was waiting for something, she said. Or someone. The investigation widened. Detectives canvassed the area. Questioned everyone. Collected statements that led nowhere. Paris swallowed details like a black hole. Every answer dissolved into noise. Every lead collapsed under scrutiny. And yet, something lingered. Claire's apartment held no signs of forced entry, which meant one thing. She knew whoever had been there. Or she had let them in. The autopsy was re-examined. This time with precision. This time with doubt. And then, buried in the data, a microscopic anomaly. A trace compound in her bloodstream. Almost undetectable. A rare sedative. Not lethal on its own. But in the right dosage, in the right context, it could slow the heart. Disrupt rhythm. Induce cardiac arrest without leaving obvious evidence. A perfect weapon. Invisible.
Clean.
Untraceable, unless you knew where to look. The case shifted overnight. This wasn't an accident. This was methodical.
Planned.
Executed with precision. A cold case in the making before the file had even cooled. Varese dug deeper. Who had access to that compound? Hospitals. Research labs. Private clinics. The list was long. Too long. but patterns began to emerge. Names repeated, locations overlapped, and buried within it all, a connection, fragile, almost accidental. Claire had translated medical documents, freelance work, contracts with pharmaceutical companies, research institutions, confidential material, technical language, sensitive information. She had access to secrets.
And someone might have one of them buried.
Her computer was seized, hard drive analyzed, files recovered, deleted, encrypted, hidden. Weeks passed, then months, each discovery raising more questions than answers. Draft translations, incomplete documents, fragments of research studies. Nothing overtly criminal, nothing worth killing for. Until one file stood out. A report, unfinished, marked confidential, referencing a clinical trial, unregistered, off the books, participants unnamed, results inconclusive, or altered. The document ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if Claire had stopped writing or been stopped. Varese felt it then. That quiet shift investigators recognize but never fully explain. The moment a case stops being random, stops being noise, and becomes something else entirely. Something deliberate. Something dangerous. He requested the full report. The company denied knowledge, denied involvement, denied everything. Officially, the trial didn't exist. Unofficially, it had to. Because Claire Dufour was dead. And someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make it look like nothing. The months stretched into years. Leads dried up. Witnesses forgot details. Files gathered dust. The media lost interest. Another unsolved case in a city full of them. Another name added to a list no one reads. Claire Dufour became a whisper. Then a memory. Then nothing. The case was archived, labeled quietly, filed away. Cold case. But cold doesn't mean dead. It means waiting. Waiting for something to surface. A mistake. A confession. A fragment of truth buried too shallow to stay hidden forever. And somewhere in Paris, someone knew exactly what had happened in apartment 3B. Someone who had watched the investigation unfold, watched it stall, watched it disappear. Someone who had stayed silent. For years. Until silence became heavier than the truth. Until memory refused to fade. Until the past began to bleed into the present. Because cases like this don't vanish. They linger. In unanswered questions. In empty rooms. In the quiet echo of a final message sent into the dark. Can we talk tonight? And in the shadow of a witness no one had found yet. Not in 2003. Not in the years that followed. But someone who had seen everything. Someone who had waited. Someone who would, decades later, step forward and shatter the silence that had buried Claire Dufour's death for far too long. The file never truly closed. It only stopped moving. Somewhere deep inside the archives of the Paris Police Prefecture, behind layers of dust and forgotten paperwork, the name Claire Dufour still existed, typed in black ink on a folder that no one had touched in years. Cold case. 3 words that sounded final, but weren't. Because cold didn't mean finished. It meant suspended, waiting, breathing quietly in the dark. And for Detective Laurent Varese, it never left. He carried it the way some men carry old scars, hidden, but never healed. Long after the case had been reassigned, long after the official investigation slowed to nothing, he would return to it. Late nights, empty offices, fluorescent lights humming overhead. He would sit alone with the file open in front of him, staring at the same photographs, the same reports, the same unanswered questions. Nothing about it felt random. Claire's death was too clean, too controlled.
No panique, no chaos.
Just precision. That kind of control required planning. And planning left traces if you knew where to look. He started with the timeline. 3 days. That was the window. 72 hours between Claire's last confirmed contact and the moment her body was found. A narrow gap, but enough for someone careful. Enough for someone disciplined. Her final movements had been reconstructed as best as possible. A cafe on Boulevard Rocacourt. A brief stop at a bookstore. A receipt timestamped at 1842. Witnesses confirmed she was alone.
Calm.
Nothing unusual. No sign of distress. Then the message. Can we talk tonight? Sent at 1913. After that, nothing. No outgoing calls. No messages. No digital trace of what happened next. But Varese knew something had happened. Something significant enough to end her life and erase itself almost completely. He revisited the apartment photos. Again, and again, and again. The wine glass. That detail never sat right. Claire lived alone. She wasn't known to entertain frequently. Neighbors described her as reserved, even distant. And yet, on that night, there was a second glass in the sink, rinsed but not washed. A thin residue clinging to the inside, barely visible unless you were looking for it. 2 glasses. 2 people. Forensic tests had come back inconclusive.
No usable prints.
No DNA. The glass had been wiped. Carefully. Deliberately. Whoever had been there had not panicked. They had taken their time. And they had known exactly what to remove. The sedative found in Claire's system complicated everything. It suggested proximity.
Trust. She hadn't been forced.
She hadn't resisted, which meant she had willingly consumed something, wine perhaps, laced with a compound she couldn't detect. Or someone had administered it directly. Either way, the conclusion remained the same. She knew her killer. Varese expanded the circle. Friends.
Colleagues. Clients.
Anyone who had interacted with Claire in the weeks leading up to her death. Interviews were conducted. Statements recorded. Patterns analyzed. And slowly, a new picture began to form. Claire had been under pressure. Subtle at first. Easy to dismiss. Missed calls. Delayed payments. Emails that went unanswered. Then cancellations. Last-minute withdrawals from projects she had already accepted. Her work had become inconsistent, erratic. One colleague described her as distracted. Another said she seemed worried about something she wouldn't explain. But no one pressed her. No one asked the question that might have changed everything. What are you afraid of? The unfinished report remained the center of attention. The unregistered clinical trial. The altered results. The abrupt ending. It was the only tangible anomaly in an otherwise ordinary life. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Varese requested access to Claire's deleted files again, this time using more advanced recovery methods. Technology had improved since 2003. What had once been lost might now be recoverable. Days turned into weeks. Then, buried beneath layers of overwritten data, something surfaced. A fragment of an email. Not complete, not intact, just enough to raise questions. You don't understand the consequences. This cannot be published. You were not supposed to keep copies.
No sender. No timestamp.
But the tone was unmistakable. A warning. Or a threat. Varese felt the case shift again.
Subtly.
Almost imperceptibly. But it was there. Claire hadn't just stumbled onto something. She had held onto it. And someone had noticed. The prepaid phone number resurfaced in his mind. Activated 2 weeks before her death. Deactivated the same night. A controlled line. Disposable. Designed to exist only as long as necessary. He traced its activity again. Every signal. Every tower connection. The data was limited, degraded by time, but not gone. 3 locations. One near Claire's apartment. One near the cafe she had visited that evening. And one more. An address in the 12th arrondissement. A private medical facility. closed in 2004. Officially, due to financial issues. Unofficially, there were rumors. Unregistered procedures. Off-the-books research. Clients who paid in cash. No questions asked. Varese visited the building. Or what was left of it. The sign had been removed years ago. Windows boarded. Doors sealed. Time had stripped it of identity. But the structure remained. A hollow shell of something that had once been active. Something that had operated quietly, away from scrutiny. He stood outside, staring at the faded entrance, and felt it again, that quiet certainty that had followed him since the beginning. This place mattered. Inside, the air was stale, dust thick enough to disturb with every step. Rooms stripped of equipment, but not entirely empty. Cabinets remained. Filing systems. Fragments of records left behind in the rush to close. Most of it was useless. Outdated. Irrelevant. But then, in a back office, hidden behind a collapsed partition, he found something that shouldn't have been there. A box. Unlabeled. Unsecured. Inside, folders. Patient records. Names redacted. Dates inconsistent. And one file partially intact. No name. Just a code. And, attached to it, a familiar term. The same compound found in Claire's bloodstream. The sedative. His pulse slowed. This wasn't coincidence. This was connection. He photographed everything, logged it, submitted it for analysis. But even before the results came back, he knew what he was looking at. Claire's case wasn't isolated. It was part of something larger. Something hidden. Something that had been buried deliberately. The question wasn't just who killed her.
It was why.
And who else knew? Back at the station, the pieces began to align, but not cleanly. Never cleanly. Each answer opened new gaps. New contradictions. The deeper he went, the more fragmented the truth became. Because someone had taken great care to break it apart.
To scatter it.
To make sure no single thread could lead to the whole. And yet, one detail refused to disappear. The witness. The elderly woman across the street. The one who had seen the man in the dark coat. The one who had described him as waiting. Watching. Her statement had been taken. Filed. Forgotten. But now, it mattered again. Because if he had been there, if he had been watching Claire's building for hours, then he hadn't just been passing through. He had been part of it. And if he had waited, he had known when to act. Varese returned to her apartment. Years later, the building unchanged. The hallway just as narrow. The air just as still. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. This time, a voice. Older now, weaker, but still there. The door opened slowly. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. Because they both knew. The past had come back. And it wasn't finished. He asked her the question he should have asked years ago. Are you absolutely certain about the man you saw? She hesitated. Not out of doubt, but out of fear. Because memory fades. But some images never leave. I remember his shoes, she said quietly. Not his face, not clearly, but the shoes, they were clean. Too clean for someone who had been standing outside that long. Like he had just arrived. Like he wasn't really waiting. Varese didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, the timeline shifted. The man hadn't been there for hours. He had wanted it to look that way. A performance. A distraction. Which meant something else had happened. Something no one had seen. Something that had slipped through unnoticed. And somewhere in that gap, between what was visible and what was hidden, Claire Dufour had died. Not by chance. Not by accident. but by design. And the design was still incomplete, because the person who had orchestrated it had never been found. Not in 2003. Not in the years that followed. But the silence was cracking. Slowly. And somewhere someone was beginning to realize that the past they had buried was starting to surface. The past does not return all at once. It leaks. Not in loud confessions or dramatic revelations, but in fragments. In details that feel too small to matter until they don't. Until they begin to align. Until they start to point somewhere dangerous. Detective Laurent Varese understood that better than most. He had spent years chasing cases that dissolved into nothing, watching truths slip through his fingers like smoke. But this one, Claire Dufour, this one had never dissolved. It had lingered incomplete. And now, piece by piece, it was beginning to move again. The shoes. It sounded insignificant. A detail most investigators would dismiss. But not Varese. Clean shoes. On a man standing outside for hours in a Paris winter.
Impossible.
Streets carried grit.
Mud. Oil.
The residue of a city that never stops moving. You don't stand still that long and remain untouched by it. Which meant the witness hadn't seen a man waiting. She had seen a man arriving. And if he had just arrived, then whatever had happened inside Claire's apartment had already begun. The timeline tightened. Varese went back to the data from the prepaid phone. 3 locations. 1 near Claire's building. 1 near the cafe. And the third, the abandoned medical facility. He overlaid the timestamps again. Adjusted for margin of error. Cross-referenced with traffic flow, surveillance gaps, witness statements. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The signal near the facility had activated first. Then silence. Then movement toward the cafe. Then toward Claire's apartment.
A route.
Controlled. Intentional. This wasn't someone reacting. This was someone executing a plan. The facility became the focal point. Not as a random location, but as a starting point. A place where something had been prepared before it was delivered to Claire. The sedative. The file he had found inside the abandoned building confirmed its presence. The same compound. Same formulation. Not commercially available. Not prescribed casually. It required access. Knowledge. Resources. And whoever had used it on Claire had all 3. Varese requested historical employee records tied to the facility. It wasn't easy. The company that had operated it had dissolved years ago. Assets sold. Documentation scattered. Some records lost entirely. Others buried in bureaucratic layers designed to slow inquiries until they died. But not this time. Names began to surface. Doctors. Researchers. Administrative staff. Contractors. A web of individuals who had once worked behind those walls, conducting operations no one officially acknowledged. Most had moved on, changed careers, relocated, disappeared into normal lives. But one name stayed close to the center. Dr. Etienne Morel. Cardiologist, specialist in arrhythmias, known for experimental approaches. Brilliant, according to peers. Unpredictable, according to critics. He had worked at the facility until its closure. Then nothing. No hospital affiliations. No private practice. No public records beyond basic civil documentation. It was as if he had stepped out of the medical world entirely. Vanished, but not gone. Varese didn't believe in disappearances without cause. He pulled Morel's archived profile, publications, conference appearances, research interests. There it was again, the pattern. Cardiac disruption. Pharmacological triggers. Controlled induction of arrhythmia. The same mechanism that had likely killed Claire. The connection tightened. But connection wasn't proof. Not yet. Varese tracked down former colleagues. Interviews stretched across weeks. Most were cooperative, some hesitant. A few refused entirely. But they all remembered Morel. Not for what he did, but for how he worked. He didn't follow protocols. He bent them.
Pushed them.
Tested limits others wouldn't touch. He was obsessed with control, one former researcher said. Not just treating the heart, controlling it, starting it, stopping it, like a switch. Another described his methods as effective, but ethically questionable. No one accused him of wrongdoing, but no one defended him either. And then came the detail that shifted everything. A nurse, retired, living outside the city. She had worked at the facility during its final year. She remembered a patient. Not by name. By outcome. A woman, she said, early 30s. No serious medical history. She wasn't supposed to be part of the trial, but she was brought in anyway, late at night.
No paperwork.
No record. Varese leaned forward. What happened to her? The nurse hesitated. Because some memories don't fade. They said it was a reaction. Unexpected. Her heart, it just stopped. Dr. Morell was there. He tried to revive her, but it was too late. Varese didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because the pattern was no longer subtle. It was repeating. A woman in her early 30s. A controlled environment. A sedative. Cardiac arrest. No official record.
No accountability.
The nurse's voice dropped. They shut everything down not long after that. Quietly. No investigation. No charges. Just closed. And Morell? He left before the doors were sealed.
No goodbye. No explanation.
The silence that followed was heavy. Because this wasn't just a theory anymore. It was a possibility with weight. But still, no direct link to Claire. Until Varese returned to her computer data. He reviewed the recovered fragments again. The unfinished report. The broken email. The deleted files that had once seemed incomplete. Now they felt different. The context changed everything. He searched for references, names, codes, identifiers that might connect her work to the facility. And then, buried in metadata, something appeared. A document reference ID. It matched the coding structure used in the files from the abandoned facility. Not identical, but similar enough to matter. Claire hadn't just translated random medical content. She had worked on something connected to that place. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. And she had kept a copy. That was the mistake. Or the reason. Because if she had kept it, then she had known. At least partially. Enough to be dangerous. Enough to become a liability. Varese reconstructed her final day again, but this time through a different lens. Not as a victim, but as someone on the edge of a discovery. She had gone to the cafe. Waited. Sent the message. Can we talk tonight? Not a random text. A request. Directed at someone she trusted or someone she needed answers from. Someone connected to the document. Someone connected to the trial. Someone connected to Morell. The prepaid phone wasn't just a tool. It was a shield. Used by someone who understood risk. Someone who had done this before. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were converging. But still, one element remained missing. The moment. What had actually happened inside apartment 3B. Because the evidence told a story, but not the whole story. Claire had opened the door. She had allowed someone in. They had shared wine. They had spoken. At some point, she had been drugged. At some point, her heart had stopped. But there was no sign of struggle. No sign of panic. Which meant one of two things. She hadn't realized what was happening. Or she had trusted the person enough not to fear it. Both possibilities led to the same conclusion. This wasn't a forced entry. This was an invitation. And invitations leave traces. Even years later, Varese returned to the apartment records, ownership history, maintenance logs, access points, and there, almost overlooked, a detail from the original report. A secondary key, issued temporarily, 3 weeks before Claire's death, for maintenance. A plumbing issue. The company responsible had logged the request, but the technician assigned had never been verified. The name was generic, the ID incomplete, a placeholder. Someone had used that entry point, not to fix anything, but to prepare. To enter without suspicion. To leave without force. The plan expanded. More precise than Varese had imagined. Because this wasn't just about that night. It had begun weeks earlier. With access. With surveillance. With timing. And Claire had never seen it coming. The realization settled in slowly. Heavy. Unavoidable. She hadn't just been targeted. She had been studied. Her habits. Her schedule. Her vulnerabilities. Everything mapped. Everything understood. And when the moment came, it had been executed flawlessly. Almost. Because perfection leaves no case. And this case was still breathing. Still shifting. Still revealing itself in fragments, too stubborn to stay buried. Varese stood at the edge of it now. Closer than anyone had been in years. But not close enough. Because the truth was still incomplete. Still waiting. And somewhere beyond the evidence, beyond the files, beyond the silent corridors of abandoned facilities and empty apartments, there was someone who knew exactly what had happened. Someone who had seen more than the rest. Someone who had remained silent. Until now. Because silence, like everything else in this case, was beginning to break. The deeper Varese went, the less the case felt like an investigation and more like a structure, carefully built, deliberately hidden, and designed to withstand time itself. Every wall he pushed against didn't collapse. It shifted. It adjusted. As if the truth wasn't resisting him but actively reorganizing itself to remain out of reach. Claire Dufour was no longer just a victim in a sealed apartment. She had become a point of convergence. A place where different threads of something larger intersected and snapped shut. And the most disturbing part was not what he had found. It was what still wasn't visible. The maintenance key entry remained the quiet fracture in the timeline. A detail too small for most investigators to dwell on, yet too precise to ignore. Someone had accessed apartment 3B weeks before Claire's death, under the guise of a plumbing inspection that never truly existed. No forced entry.
No alarms. No witnesses.
Just permission, fabricated or abused. Varese revisited the property management records again, this time digging deeper into subcontractors, rotational assignments, temporary staff logs. What he found wasn't a clear identity, but something more unsettling. Repetition without origin. The same technician ID, appearing in multiple properties across the district during unrelated maintenance windows, always incomplete, always unverifiable. A ghost pattern inside bureaucratic noise. Someone had been moving through systems designed to track movement and avoiding every layer of verification. He printed the records and spread them across his desk. The office lights buzzed faintly above him, the sound merging with the steady pulse of his own thoughts. Patterns rarely announce themselves. They emerge slowly, like stains spreading through fabric. This one was spreading everywhere. Then came the second fracture. A renewed analysis of Claire's encrypted drive revealed something overlooked in the earlier rush of recovery, a synchronization artifact, a hidden backup process that had activated automatically in the final days before her death. It wasn't initiated by her. It was triggered remotely. Someone had accessed her system without leaving conventional traces. not through brute force, not through phishing or direct intrusion, but through timing, exploiting a window where her device had been connected to a shared network. A cafe network. The same cafe on Boulevard Rocacourt. Varese leaned back slowly, eyes narrowing. The cafe was no longer just a location. It was a pivot point, a controlled environment where digital and physical presence overlapped. Claire had been there. She had connected. She had been observed. And someone had been waiting for that exact moment. He requested surveillance footage retrieval again, even though he already knew the limitations. Most of 2003's recordings had long been overwritten or degraded, but fragments still existed, archived backups, low-resolution captures, partial system logs. And sometimes fragments were enough. What emerged was barely visible at first, a grayscale smear of movement outside the cafe window, a figure standing too still, not inside, not interacting, just positioned at an angle that allowed observation without engagement. The same detail returned.
Stillness.
Control. Presence without footprint. The figure could not be identified, but its positioning was deliberate, always near reflective surfaces, always at the edge of visibility, always outside direct recognition range. Someone who understood surveillance better than those who relied on it. The investigation pivoted again toward Dr. Etienne Morel. But this time, the question was no longer whether he was involved. It was how deeply. Varese pushed for access to Morel's financial history. That proved more difficult than expected. Most accounts had been closed or absorbed into corporate restructuring. But not all movement disappears. It leaves pressure points, irregular transfers, indirect payments, anonymized consulting fees routed through third parties. And one pattern emerged. Multiple payments tied to consulting work for pharmaceutical intermediaries. But one recurring anomaly stood out. Small, consistent transfers labeled under Research Advisory Services that led to an offshore account linked to a shell foundation. The foundation had no public presence. No board. No declared activity. Just a name. And a cycle of financial movement that coincided with the operational timeline of the facility. The more Varese followed it, the more it felt like approaching something intentionally segmented, each layer designed to protect the next, each connection requiring a new key. And Claire had likely found one of them. The broken report she had been translating was no longer just a document. It was evidence of structural continuity between the abandoned facility and ongoing private research channels. Not everything had shut down in 2004. Some parts had simply changed shape. Moved underground. Claire had been working on translation drafts involving pharmacological data tied to cardiac modulation protocols. Not theoretical. Applied.
Structured.
And most importantly, consistent with the sedative found in her bloodstream. But there was a detail hidden in her annotations that Varese had initially dismissed. A margin note. A short phrase repeated twice in her recovered drafts. Not isolated. At first, it meant nothing. Now, it meant everything. Because if Claire believed the case wasn't isolated, then she hadn't seen herself as the only subject. She had seen a pattern, which meant she had been looking beyond her own discovery. She had been connecting dots the investigation hadn't even acknowledged yet. Varese expanded his scope outward. Similar cases. Unexplained cardiac deaths. Low-profile incidents from the early 2000s. Cases dismissed as natural causes. Stress-related heart failure. Undetermined arrhythmia.
Dozens of them.
Scattered across different districts, different hospitals, different years. But when plotted together, a subtle alignment began to form. Age range clustering, medical history consistency, and a recurring absence of trauma. No violence. No toxins on initial screening. Just sudden cardiac cessation without explanation. Individually, each case had been insignificant. Together, they formed a silhouette. And that silhouette pointed back to the same origin point. The facility. Or what it had become after closure. But something still didn't fit. If Morel, or someone connected to him, was responsible for this scale of activity, why Claire? Why a translator?
Why now?
The answer arrived not through evidence, but through behavior analysis. Claire had not been a passive observer. She had been actively communicating before her death. The "Can we talk tonight?" message was not a casual exchange.
It was targeted outreach.
Directed. Intentional. Which meant she believed someone would respond. And someone had. But not in the way she expected. Varese revisited the phone trace data again. The prepaid device had connected briefly after Claire's message. A short exchange window. Less than 8 minutes.
No audio.
No text logs recovered. But timing alone told a story. Someone had replied. Someone had agreed to meet. And that meeting had been the final step. The sequence tightened further.
Cafe.
Message.
Response.
Movement to apartment. Everything aligned like a controlled chain reaction. But there was still a gap. A missing interaction. Because Claire's neighbors had reported no sign of struggle.
No shouting.
No physical disturbance. Which meant the final moments had not escalated violently. They had unfolded quietly. Almost clinically. Which raised the most disturbing possibility yet. Claire may not have realized she was in danger until it was too late. Or she had accepted it. Because trust, once established, can override instinct. And someone in her life had established that trust. Not a stranger. Not a random encounter. Someone who had been close enough to know her routines, her habits, her thresholds. Someone who didn't need to break in. Because they had already been let inside. Varese stood in silence for a long moment, staring at the map of connections pinned across his wall. Lines intersecting between the cafe, the facility, Claire's apartment, the financial routes, the digital traces. It was no longer a scattered investigation. It was a system. And systems don't collapse easily. They resist exposure. The question now was no longer whether Morel was involved. It was whether Morel was alone. Because the structure behind Claire's death no longer looked like a single actor. It looked like coordination. And coordination implied hierarchy. Which meant Claire's case might have been only one layer of something far larger still hidden beneath official history. And somewhere in that hidden space, someone was aware that Varese was closing in. Because the pattern that had stayed buried for years was no longer stable. It was beginning to shift under pressure. And pressure always demands a response. Pressure always reveals what silence protects. And now, for the first time since Claire Dufour's death in 2003, the silence around her case was no longer intact. It was flexing, cracking in places no one had expected. Not with noise, not with confession, but with accumulation of fragments, patterns, and connections that refused to stay isolated. Detective Laurent Varese could feel it changing shape. The case was no longer just about a woman in apartment 3B. It had become something else. A system with memory. And systems like that do not remain dormant forever. They react. The first reaction came quietly. A routine request submitted by Varese for updated cross-referencing of medical anomalies tied to early 2000s cardiac deaths was delayed. Not denied. Not rejected. Just delayed. A bureaucratic pause that should have meant nothing, but did. Because delays, in his experience, rarely occurred randomly. They occurred when someone was watching. He noted it, did not comment on it, but he felt the shift immediately. Someone had seen the direction of his work and had chosen not to stop it yet. That was new. Before, the case had resisted passively. Files hidden, records incomplete, witnesses silent. Now it was different. Now it was observing back. Varese returned again to Dr. Etienne Morel, not because there were new facts, but because there was still no end to the pattern surrounding him. Every thread touched his orbit, but stopped just short of direct confirmation. Morel was not absent. He was strategically absent, which, in investigative terms, was far more significant. A man who disappears completely leaves chaos. A man who disappears precisely leaves design. And design implies intention. Varese requested a deeper reconstruction of Morel's final known movements before the closure of the medical facility in 2004. What surfaced was fragmented but revealing. There had been a final week of activity inside the facility that was not recorded in official closure documentation. Staff logs showed presence. Energy consumption records confirmed operation. Internal communications, partially recovered, referenced finalization protocols. Then everything stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. As if something had been shut down manually. And Morel had been present during that final phase. But his departure was not recorded through normal channels.
No exit clearance.
No travel documentation tied to employment closure procedures. Instead, a gap appeared, 48 hours where he existed in no recorded system at all. Then he reappeared. In civilian records. With no transition. That gap became the new focus. Because gaps like that are rarely accidental. They are constructed. The more Varese studied it, the more he saw a pattern forming not just in Claire's case, but across everything linked to Morel and the facility. Each anomaly followed the same structure. Presence, activity, disappearance, normalization. Like a loop designed to erase continuity. But not erase existence. Preserve functionality without attribution. The question shifted again. If Morel had built or contributed to this system, then Claire's death was not an isolated event. It was a breach. A point where the system failed to contain exposure. Which meant Claire was not targeted randomly. She was selected. Because she had crossed a threshold. Varese reopened Claire's recovered drafts once more. This time focusing not on content but on tone, language patterns, repetition, emphasis. And something subtle emerged. Her writing had changed in the final weeks. Earlier drafts were technical, neutral, professional. Later drafts carried urgency. Not explicit panic, but compression, shorter sentences, fragmented thoughts, an increased reliance on coded references instead of direct terminology. As if she had begun to suspect she was being monitored. Or understood. One annotation stood out more than the rest. They don't delete everything. They rewrite access. That single sentence reframed the entire investigation. Rewrite access. Not erase. Not destroy. Reassign. Which explained the maintenance key anomaly. Which explained the system gaps. Which explained the missing technician identity. Someone wasn't removing traces. They were relocating them within controlled structures. Making past actions appear as authorized activity. Turning intrusion into procedure. And procedure into invisibility. The cafe connection returned to focus again. Varese requested environmental reconstruction, lighting conditions, seating layout, sight lines. Even years later, architectural models allowed partial reconstruction of visibility fields. And one detail became impossible to ignore. From a specific seat inside the cafe, Claire would have had a direct line of sight to the street outside. To the exact position where someone could observe her without entering. Which meant she had not been randomly targeted inside the cafe. She had been observed before she entered. Someone already knew she would be there. Which implied pre-awareness of her schedule. Not guesswork. Not coincidence. Knowledge. That shifted the entire structure of the case again. Because knowledge of that precision requires proximity. Not necessarily physical, but informational. Someone had access to her behavioral patterns before the event. And that access had to come from one of two sources: her professional environment, or someone she trusted. Varese revisited Claire's translation contracts again.
Pharmaceutical client.
Research institutions. Confidential documentation. But now he looked for something different. Not what she translated, but what she had access to beyond translation. And there it was. A recurring assignment code tied to a subcontracting agency that handled sensitive medical transcription for multiple private research entities, including organizations indirectly linked, through layers of intermediaries, to the defunct facility. Claire had been moving through information corridors she did not fully understand. And someone had been monitoring those corridors. The realization settled heavier this time. Claire had not stumbled into danger. She had walked through a monitored system until she touched something that responded. The final piece of the puzzle remained the witness. The elderly woman. Her memory of the man outside the building. Varese returned to her statement file again, but this time he noticed something previously overlooked. A supplemental note added days after the initial interview. The witness had mentioned something else. Something she had hesitated to include. The man outside Claire's building had not just been standing. He had been looking upward. Not at windows randomly, but at a specific floor. At a specific apartment. Apartment 3B. Which meant he was not waiting for someone to arrive. He was confirming presence. Confirming location. Confirming timing. That detail changed everything. Because it meant Claire's killer was not improvising. They were synchronizing. And synchronization requires coordination across multiple stages. Varese now understood why the case resisted closure for so long. It wasn't because evidence was missing. It was because evidence had been distributed. Across roles. Across time. Across systems designed to prevent aggregation. And yet, aggregation was exactly what was now happening. The case was assembling itself. Slowly. Unavoidably. But as the structure became clearer, something else emerged alongside it. A warning. Not spoken. Not written. But procedural. Another delay request appeared in one of his data queries. This time more aggressive. Access throttled. Metadata partially restricted. Not enough to stop him, but enough to signal recognition. Someone somewhere had noticed the convergence and had begun adjusting accordingly. Varese closed the file. Not out of fear, but recognition. Because this was no longer just investigation. It was engagement. And somewhere beyond the official records, beyond archived systems and erased identities, the structure that had remained hidden since 2003 was no longer passive. It was reacting. Not loudly. Not openly. But precisely. And precision, in cases like this, always meant one thing. The system was preparing to protect itself. And that meant the truth was now close enough to threaten it. The system did not announce its defenses. It simply adjusted.
Subtly.
Quietly. Almost politely, like a door closing a fraction earlier than expected, like a conversation that suddenly becomes selective about what it reveals. Detective Laurent Varese felt it immediately. Not as a single obstruction, but as a pattern of resistance spreading across his access points. Files that had been retrievable yesterday now required additional authorization layers. Archive responses slowed by seconds that felt intentional. Cross-reference data returned with omissions too precise to be accidental. It was not a shutdown. It was calibration. Someone was shaping the perimeter of what he was allowed to see. And that meant one thing. The convergence point he had been approaching was now acknowledged by something other than himself. The case had been noticed. Claire Dufour's name, once a quiet entry in a cold case archive, now seemed to carry weight inside systems that were not supposed to care. Varese did not stop. He redirected. If digital doors were narrowing, he would move through physical ones. The first stop was the abandoned medical facility again, but this time not as a crime scene, but as a structure with memories still embedded in its walls. Daylight filtered through broken glass as he entered, dust rising like disturbed breath. The building did not feel empty anymore. It felt paused, as if something inside it had simply been waiting for the correct sequence to resume. He moved through corridors stripped of purpose, each room echoing with the absence of what once operated there. But now he was looking differently. Not for records. Not for evidence left behind. For behavior. For repetition. For the way space itself had been used. In the central wing, he found it a layout inconsistency. A wall section that did not match architectural schematics. Slightly thicker. Slightly newer. Concealed behind paneling that had been deliberately removed but never fully dismantled. The kind of modification that does not announce itself, it integrates itself. He pressed against it.
Hollow.
Not structural support.
A passage.
The air changed when he forced entry.
Cooler.
Still. Controlled. This was not abandonment. This was concealment. Inside was a secondary corridor system, smaller, narrower, designed not for public medical activity, but for movement unseen by standard oversight. Wiring ran along sealed conduits. Old monitoring equipment still partially embedded in the walls. A network that had once been active, but never fully documented in official closure reports. And at the end of it, another room.
Smaller.
Functional. Not clinical. Operational. A chair, fixed to the floor. Metal restraints removed, but mounting points still visible. A table with reinforced surface. And above it, faint discoloration in the ceiling, chemical residue that had aged into invisibility unless you knew how to look. This was not a treatment room. It was a controlled environment. And it had been used. Repeatedly. Varese did not need confirmation anymore. The structure itself was testimony. This was where procedures had taken place outside official oversight, where control over physiological response had been tested, refined, and standardized. The sedative found in Claire's system was not an isolated instrument. It was part of a method. He photographed everything, but even as he documented it, he knew documentation was no longer the objective. Understanding was. Because now the question was not just who killed Claire Dufour. It was how many times had this been done before her. Back at the station, he pushed for expanded historical correlation analysis. Not just similar deaths, but procedural similarities. Medical anomalies that matched controlled cardiac suppression profiles. The results came slowly at first. Then, all at once. Cases surfaced from multiple districts across Paris. Early 2000s. Some late 1990s. All initially classified as natural causes or undetermined cardiac failure.
No visible trauma.
No confirmed toxins. No criminal classification sustained beyond preliminary review. Individually, they had been dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern too precise to ignore. Age range clustering again. Victims mostly in their 30s. No known medical predisposition. Sudden collapse. Minimal external indicators. And in several cases, anomalous traces of similar compounds, never fully identified due to degradation or limited testing scope at the time. Varese marked each case, overlaying them across a timeline. And then he saw it. The density spike. A concentrated cluster of cases within a narrow operational window between 2001 and 2004. The same period as the facility's final years. And Claire's death sat at the tail end of that cluster. Not as an outlier, but as continuation. This was no longer about a single institution. It was about a methodology that had extended beyond its official existence. Which raised the next question immediately. If it continued after closure, where did it move? The answer was not in records. It was in absence. Financial restructuring patterns pointed to dissolved entities, but dissolved did not mean inactive. It meant restructured ownership chains, shell foundations, consultancy fronts, medical advisory services with no physical footprint but persistent financial movement. And one recurring node appeared across multiple datasets. A consulting consortium registered under rotating names, each iteration slightly different, each legally distinct, but all funneling through the same financial intermediaries. And buried within that network was a familiar signature. Dr. Etienne Morel. But now his role was no longer confined to a single institution. He appeared across multiple advisory layers. Not publicly. Not directly. But through indirect contribution patterns, research attribution overlaps, and anonymized consultation credits. He was not absent from the system. He was distributed across it. Which meant Varese had been wrong earlier. Morel was not simply connected to the facility. He was part of what replaced it. And Claire had intersected with that replacement structure. The cafe now re-emerged in significance, but differently. Not as a meeting point but as a data capture node. A place where observation could be converted into timing, where physical presence intersected with digital awareness. Varese requested reconstruction of communication latency windows between Claire's device activity and known signal points from the prepaid phone. The overlap revealed something subtle but decisive. The response to Claire's message had not come from a static location. It had moved. Which meant the responder was mobile during the communication window. Not stationary. Not waiting. Following. Which reframed everything again. Claire had not initiated a meeting with someone already in place. She had triggered a response from someone already tracking her movement in real time. And that level of tracking required more than access. It required integration into systems she used daily. Possibly even unknowingly. The conclusion was uncomfortable but unavoidable. Claire's professional environment had been compromised at multiple levels. Not through direct hacking, but through structural infiltration of service providers, subcontractors, and data handling intermediaries. The system did not need to break in. It had already been built inside. And Claire had been moving through it like a user unaware of the architecture surrounding her. Varese felt the shape of the truth tightening. Not yet complete. But no longer abstract. And then came the second warning. Not from systems. From people. An interview request he had scheduled with a retired administrative staff member tied to the facility was suddenly cancelled.
No explanation. No rescheduling.
Just withdrawal. Followed by silence. And then another. And another. Within hours, 3 separate potential witnesses had become unreachable. Not deceased. Not relocated. Just unavailable. As if something had quietly instructed them to stop engaging. That was the moment Varese understood the shift had escalated. This was no longer passive resistance. It was containment. Someone was actively reducing the number of live variables in the investigation.
Not to stop him,
but to slow convergence. Because convergence always leads to exposure. And exposure leads to collapse. He sat alone in the station that night, files spread across his desk, the pattern now fully visible in its outline, but still missing its center. Claire Dufour had not been an endpoint. She had been a breach. A failure in a controlled system that had operated beyond public awareness for years. And now that breach was expanding.
not randomly,
not chaotically, but according to pressure. And pressure always moves toward release. Somewhere in Paris, someone was already preparing for that release. Not by hiding anymore, but by adjusting the structure itself. Because when systems begin to fail, the first priority is no longer secrecy. It is survival. And survival requires control. Even if control means rewriting the story one more time. Control always leaves fingerprints. Not the obvious kind. Not blood, not prints, not fibers. Control leaves absences shaped too precisely to be natural.
Gaps that align.
Witnesses that vanish at the same moment. Data that thins out exactly where it should become most informative. Detective Laurent Varese had seen enough investigations to recognize that pattern. But he had never seen one react this fast. 3 witness withdrawals in less than a day. 1 canceled interview. 2 unreachable contacts. No official alerts. No administrative explanations that held weight. Just quiet disappearance from availability, as if someone had simply stepped between the system and its inputs and turned the dial down. Not erased. Muted. That distinction mattered. Because erasure was messy. It left residue. But muting suggested ongoing access. Ongoing presence. Someone wasn't dismantling the case. They were managing its volume. Varese stood in the station corridor long after midnight, staring at the glass wall covered in printed timelines, financial threads, and reconstructed movement patterns. The case no longer felt like a story he was solving. It felt like a perimeter he had crossed without realizing, and something on the other side had noticed the breach. Claire Dufour was still at the center. But now she was no longer alone in the diagram. The pattern had expanded.
Not outward.
Downward. Into layers that had been deliberately structured to avoid detection as a whole. The abandoned medical facility had been the first physical confirmation of that structure. But it was no longer just a site. It was a node, one of many, now implied rather than confirmed. And everything pointing back to it shared the same structural behavior: compartmentalization, redundancy, controlled visibility. The system did not rely on secrecy. It relied on fragmentation, which meant no single person was supposed to see it whole. Varese had begun to. And that was why the resistance was intensifying. Here he opened the consolidated case map, overlaying all confirmed and suspected links again. Claire's apartment, the cafe, the facility, the financial intermediary network, the anonymized consulting chain tied to Morel. And then the timing layer. When he aligned everything by hour rather than by date, something subtle emerged. Synchronization points. Not many, but precise. Moments where independent systems, digital access, physical movement, communication signals converged within narrow time windows. Each one tied to Claire's final 72 hours. It was not random movement. It was orchestration. And orchestration requires a conductor. Varese returned to Dr. Etienne Morel again, but now with a different focus. Not biography, not role history, not even financial trace, but presence density. Where did Morel appear most frequently across overlapping systems? The answer was unsettling. Not at the facility. Not at Claire's apartment. Not even at the cafe. But between them. In intermediary systems. In access layers. In transition points. He was not anchoring the operation. He was facilitating it. That changed the interpretation entirely. Morel was not the origin of the structure. He was its interface. A translator between physical action and systemic invisibility, which meant someone else had to exist above or beyond him. Someone who designed the architecture he operated within. Varese felt the case shift again. The center of gravity moved slightly, like a locked mechanism turning one notch further than expected. He requested full cross-referencing of all personnel linked indirectly to Morel through consultancy overlaps. The system returned hundreds of entries, most irrelevant, most diluted through layers of abstraction. But one subset stood out. Repeated advisory signatures tied to strategic research oversight committees. Not medical. Not clinical. Administrative. governance-level advisory structures embedded within private medical research networks, entities that did not conduct experiments directly, but shaped permissions, funding pathways, and operational boundaries. And within that subset, a recurring anonymized identifier appeared. Not a name. A designation. Project Liaison. Always present in high-level coordination documents. Never directly involved in execution. Only in authorization flows. Varese stared at the pattern for a long time. Because that role explained everything and nothing at the same time. It explained why Morel could operate across multiple systems without appearing central. It explained how the facility could close without collapsing the network. It explained how Claire could be monitored without obvious surveillance. But it did not explain identity. And identity was the one thing still missing. He returned to Claire's recovered drafts again, now searching not for content, but for relational language, pronouns, implied references, indirect naming structures. And there it was again. A pattern of avoidance. She rarely named individuals directly in her final documents. Instead, she used structural descriptors. The intermediary. The consultant chain. The reviewer layer. But once, only once, she wrote something more specific in a margin note that had been partially erased in the digital recovery process. He doesn't decide anything. He just passes it upward. That sentence reframed Morel again. Not as origin. Not as controller. But as transmission. Which meant the real center of the system still had not been identified. And that realization brought with it a new problem. Because systems of this complexity do not allow their center to remain exposed for long. They relocate it. Or dissolve it. Or ensure it never appears in isolated form. Varese felt the investigation narrowing again, not from lack of data, but from increasing structural protection around the highest layer. The closer he got to coherence, the more the system responded by dispersing interpretability. But there was something else now. A change in tone. Not in files. Not in data. In behavior. The resistance was no longer only administrative. It was interpersonal. A courier arrived at the station with a misdirected file transfer request, specifically referencing Claire's case number. The document inside was irrelevant, procedural paperwork unrelated to his investigation, but the timing was too precise to ignore. It was a message without language. A reminder. He was being watched at the operational level. Not just digitally. Physically. Which meant someone had access to his workflow in real time. That realization tightened the air around the case. Because observation changes behavior. And behavior changes exposure risk. Varese stopped sharing internal queries through standard channels. He isolated his access, moved to offline reconstruction, rebuilt parts of the network manually using printed archives, crossnotes, and reconstructed logs. The system could still resist him, but it could no longer fully see him. For the first time, the balance shifted slightly back toward the investigator. And that shift produced something immediate.
Clarity.
He re-examined the prepaid phone trace again under stricter isolation parameters. The mobile pattern that had once appeared as simple movement now resolved into something more structured. It was not just following Claire. It was triangulating her. Every movement point corresponded not only to her location but to anticipated future position.
Which meant prediction was involved.
Not surveillance alone. Behavioral modeling. Someone had been simulating her choices in advance. Which meant Claire's life had been mapped not just observationally, but probabilistically. And if that was true, then her final message was not a trigger. It was an expected outcome. She had not surprised them. She had confirmed their model. Varese felt something shift in his understanding of her death at that moment. Claire had not been eliminated because she was unpredictable. She had been eliminated because she had confirmed she was predictable. And predictability, in a controlled system is dangerous when it becomes self-aware. The system could tolerate ignorance. It could not tolerate recognition, which brought everything back to the witness. The elderly woman. Her memory of the man in the dark coat. Now reinterpreted, it was no longer just observation of presence. It was confirmation of execution phase timing. He was not waiting for Claire. He was verifying completion conditions. And that meant there was a moment, precise, structured, brief, where the system transitioned from observation to resolution. A moment no one else had seen. Except perhaps Claire herself. Varese returned to the original apartment report again. The autopsy notes, the environmental scan, the timeline reconstruction. And then he noticed something that had been overlooked for years. A minor discrepancy in temperature estimation of time of death based on environmental modeling versus body cooling rate. A deviation of less than 2 hours. But enough to matter. Enough to suggest Claire did not die exactly when assumed. She may have died earlier. Or later. But not where the narrative placed it. Which meant the sequence of events inside apartment 3B was not fully understood. And that missing segment, those unknown hours, contained the final truth. The case was no longer just about identifying a killer. It was about reconstructing a controlled environment that had successfully rewritten its own timeline. And somewhere inside that rewritten space, something had happened that no report had captured. Something that still had not been explained. And something that, even after 20 years, still had not finished speaking. Time, in cases like this, is never stable. It bends under pressure. It stretches when examined too closely. And sometimes it fractures, leaving gaps that no reconstruction can fully repair. Detective Laurent Varese understood that now not as theory, but as structure. Claire Dufour's final hours were not a sequence anymore. They were a contested space. Something had been edited. Not erased. Not destroyed. Edited. And that was far more dangerous. Because editing implies intention after the fact. It means someone had returned to the moment and reshaped its interpretation. The discrepancy in the time of death was no longer a minor inconsistency. It had become the center of gravity. Everything else, movement patterns, witness accounts, digital traces, now orbited around that instability. If Claire had died earlier than reported, then the entire chain of events reconstructed around her final message, her cafe visit, and the prepaid phone response was misaligned. And if it was misaligned, then someone had deliberately built the misalignment. Varese isolated himself again, cutting all incoming procedural noise. The station's fluorescent hum faded into background static as he worked alone, reconstructing the timeline from raw data fragments rather than compiled reports. He removed interpretation layers, removed assumptions, removed institutional summaries that had, over time, hardened into false certainty. What remained was unstable, but honest. Claire's last confirmed external activity, cafe visit, 1842. Message sent, 1913. Prepaid phone activation, within minutes of message. Arrival at apartment, estimated between 2000 hours and 2030. Time of death, official shortly after midnight. But the environmental variance suggested something else entirely. A narrower window. Earlier. Possibly before the apartment was ever entered in the conventional sense. Varese stopped at that thought. Before it was entered. Because that implied something counterintuitive. That the apartment may not have been the primary site of death. Only the final stage. He returned to the maintenance access records again. The temporary key assignment. The unverifiable technician. The repeated system entries across multiple properties. And this time, he stopped treating it as access. He treated it as distribution. What if the maintenance entry was not used for intrusion? What if it was used for preparation? He expanded the architectural model of apartment 3B. Ventilation layout. Water access points. electrical junctions, structural voids, and something emerged. A secondary service channel. Not large enough for movement, but sufficient for environmental manipulation. Temperature control systems in older Parisian buildings often ran partially decentralized, not fully integrated into modern monitoring grids. Small adjustments could be made manually at junction points without triggering centralized alerts, which meant environmental conditions inside the apartment could have been altered without visible intrusion.
Temperature. Air circulation.
Even localized pressure shifts, which directly affected forensic interpretation of time of death. The realization was quiet, but absolute. Someone had not just killed Claire. They had calibrated her death. Not as a moment, but as a window. Varese leaned back, staring at the reconstructed model. This was no longer just murder. It was environmental design. A controlled scenario built to produce a specific forensic outcome. And that meant the perpetrator was not simply eliminating a person. They were managing perception, which brought him back to the witness. The elderly woman. Her memory of the man outside the building was now the only external human observation unfiltered by system reconstruction. And even that was imperfect, colored by time, by distance, by emotional memory degradation. But one detail remained stable. His stillness. Not waiting. Not pacing. Positioned. Controlled. A man not reacting to uncertainty, but confirming alignment, which suggested he was not the primary actor. He was the observer of completion. The system had witnesses inside and outside, each assigned a function. And Claire had been at the intersection of both. Varese pulled every available communication record from the final 24 hours again. Not just Claire's, but surrounding network activity in her immediate geographic area. Mobile tower pings, data bursts, background device signals. And there it was. A pattern hidden in density fluctuations. Two distinct communication clusters overlapped in her vicinity during the final evening. One cluster corresponded to Claire's known movements. The other did not belong to her devices, or any civilian device registered in the area. It was intermittent. Low signature. Structured in bursts rather than continuous flow. The same pattern seen near the abandoned facility during its operational years. A legacy signal structure. Still active. Or, at least still replicated. Varese traced it backward. The signal didn't originate near Claire's apartment. It converged toward it from multiple surrounding points, like a net tightening. And at the center of that net, Claire had been stationary for a period longer than previously recorded. That changed everything again, because it meant she had not moved directly from cafe to apartment under simple progression. There had been a pause, an unaccounted interval, a missing segment of time. And in that missing segment, something had occurred that was not recorded by any official system. Not digital. Not witness-based. Not forensic. But behavioral. Claire had made no outgoing calls during that window. No movement detected. But her device had briefly connected to a local network node not tied to any public infrastructure. A private relay point. One that had not been registered in any consumer mapping system. Varese cross-referenced it, and the result returned a partial match. Not a location. A classification. Medical adjacent infrastructure node. Experimental communication relay. Decommissioned. Or supposedly decommissioned. His mind tightened around the implication. Claire had not been isolated in her final hours. She had been inside a monitored microenvironment. Not physical confinement. Digital and structural containment. A controlled bubble where perception could be managed, which reframed her final message entirely. Can we talk tonight? Not a request for conversation. A confirmation signal. She already knew she was inside a controlled interaction field, and she was attempting to break it, which meant her killer did not simply respond to her message. They responded to her recognition of the system itself. Varese stood abruptly, moving back to the physical reconstruction of the facility network. If similar relay nodes existed near Claire's apartment, they likely had historical counterparts tied to earlier phases of the same system. He mapped them outward, and a pattern emerged across Paris. A constellation of dormant communication points, formerly medical adjacent, formerly research-linked, all decommissioned on paper, all disconnected from official grids, but geometrically distributed, intentionally spaced, like infrastructure designed not for operation, but for coordination across time. He realized then that the abandoned facility was not an isolated remnant. It was one node in a distributed architecture, and Claire had been caught inside its residual network layer. The system had not needed to operate openly. It only needed legacy presence. And that presence was enough to shape outcomes decades later. The realization carried a new weight, because if the system still had functional remnants, then it still had operators, or at least maintainers, people who ensured that its structure remained intact even after official dissolution. And those people would not tolerate exposure. The witness, the delays, the witness withdrawals, everything now aligned into a single behavioral response. Containment escalation. Varese returned to the witness file again, not for memory, but for pattern correction. The woman had described shoes too clean, a man positioned too precisely, a presence that felt observational rather than chaotic. Now it made sense. He had not been an intruder reacting to an unknown situation. He had been an inspector confirming a controlled endpoint, which meant Claire's death had been logged somewhere. Not officially, but structurally, as a completed event within an internal system. And systems like that do not forget completion. They audit it. The implication was suffocating, because it meant Claire's case was not an anomaly. It was an entry. And entries imply lists. And lists imply scale. Varese looked at the map of interconnected nodes across Paris, now fully illuminated in his reconstruction. And for the first time, he understood what he was truly looking at. Not a murder investigation, not even a network, but an architecture of controlled outcomes. And Claire Dufour had been one of its failures. Not because she died, but because something about her death had not remained fully contained. Something had escaped the structure, and that escape was still unfolding. Something escapes a structure only once. After that, it is no longer an accident. It is precedent. Detective Laurent Varese understood that now with a clarity that felt less like discovery and more like exposure. Claire Dufour was not simply a victim inside a controlled environment anymore. She was the first confirmed rupture in something designed to remain invisible. And ruptures do not stay isolated. They propagate. The architecture he had reconstructed across Paris, those decommissioned relay nodes, the abandoned medical facility, the financial abstraction layers tied to morale, no longer felt like historical residue. It felt operational.
Current. Maintained.
Not active in the way systems announce themselves, but active in the way lungs continue breathing even when the body is asleep. Invisible continuity. That was the real threat. Because invisible systems do not need permission to persist. They only need neglect. And for years, they had been granted exactly that. Varese returned to the central contradiction again. Claire's death had been classified, archived, and sealed as an undetermined cardiac failure. A closed interpretation built on incomplete data, stabilized by institutional inertia. But now that interpretation no longer held. Not because new evidence contradicted it directly, but because too many independent systems were pointing away from it at the same time. He stared at the reconstructed timeline pinned across his workspace, every layer now separated into its own analytical plane: physical movement, digital traces, financial flows, environmental conditions, witness memory. Each layer, on its own, still appeared fragmented. But when aligned, they no longer behaved like fragments. They behaved like design. And design always implies a designer. The question was no longer whether Dr. Etienne Morel was involved. That question had already evolved past him. Morel was a conduit, a structural operator, a distributed node across a system too large to be contained within a single identity, which meant the real center still had not been named. And that absence was now the most active element in the entire investigation. Because absence in controlled systems is never empty. It is protected. Varese shifted focus back to Claire, not as a victim, but as a point of interference. If she had been a rupture, then something about her had interacted incorrectly with the system. He re-examined her translation work again, but this time not for content or metadata, but for relational positioning. Which documents she had handled, which intermediaries had passed them, which revisions she had been asked to clarify. And one pattern became unavoidable. She had been repeatedly assigned to the same category of material across different clients: medical regulatory documentation involving cardiac intervention protocols. Not random assignments. Not freelance coincidence. Repetition. Which meant selection. Claire had not been drifting through unrelated contracts. She had been routed through a controlled distribution network that filtered sensitive material through multiple translation layers before final aggregation. And somewhere along that chain, she had encountered something that was not meant to be reassembled. The unfinished report she had translated, the one referencing an unregistered clinical trial, was no longer just evidence of wrongdoing. It was a structural map fragment. A partial view of a system that required fragmentation to remain undetected. And Claire, by doing her job too well, had begun to reassemble it. That was the breach. Not curiosity. Coherence. The system could tolerate fragments. It could not tolerate reconstruction. Varese leaned back slowly, the realization settling into something colder than suspicion. Claire had not been targeted because she knew too much. She had been targeted because she was capable of making dispersed knowledge whole. He exhaled, then returned to the witness file again. The elderly woman. Her memory had once seemed peripheral. Now it was central again, but interpreted differently. The man outside Claire's building was no longer just a watcher. He was a validator. Someone confirming that the system's final stage had executed correctly. But that raised a new problem. If confirmation had occurred externally, then internal confirmation must also exist. Somewhere within the structure, Claire's death had been recorded, acknowledged, or processed. Which meant documentation existed. Not in public archives, but within controlled layers. He began tracing archival anomalies again, focusing not on missing data, but on overconsistency. Records that appeared too complete, too clean, too aligned with procedural expectations. And that's where he found it. A sealed internal audit trail tied to medical-adjacent incident reviews between 2002 and 2004. Not publicly accessible. Not referenced in any external reporting, but referenced indirectly in financial restructuring logs tied to dissolved research entities. It was not a single document. It was a framework. A parallel reporting structure used to classify outcomes without exposing operational detail. And within that framework, incidents were not described as deaths. They were described as events. Each event categorized. Each categorized event assigned a resolution status. Contained. Unresolved. Transferred. Completed. Claire's case, if it existed within that structure, would not appear as a homicide. It would appear as completion status under ambiguous classification, which meant her death had already been processed somewhere else. Not as an investigation, but as a system output. Varese felt the implications compress around him. Because if Claire's death had been processed internally, then the system had already moved past the question of guilt. It had moved to management. And management implies ongoing authority. He shifted again, returning to Morell's financial network, the shell foundations, the advisory consortiums, the anonymized consulting layers. And then something changed in the pattern. One of the financial nodes previously marked as inactive had shown recent microactivity. Not large transfers, not structural changes, but minimal routing adjustments. Tiny movements of capital through dormant channels. Reactivation signals. Someone had touched the system recently. Not to rebuild it, but to test it. Varese traced the origin of the adjustment. It did not come from Morell's known accounts. It came from an intermediary layer even further removed. A governance-linked advisory structure that had never been fully dissolved. Its designation appeared only in encrypted metadata headers. Continuity oversight layer. No public footprint. No registered leadership. No defined jurisdiction. But persistent existence. And that persistence explained everything that had been happening around him. The delays, the witness withdrawals, the data throttling, the coordinated silences. It was not reaction. It was governance. He was not being obstructed by individuals. He was being filtered by structure. And structures like that do not defend themselves emotionally. They defend themselves automatically, which made them far more dangerous. The realization forced a recalibration. If the continuity oversight layer existed, then Morell's role was not central at all. He was operational. Replaceable. Which meant Claire's killer was not the origin of the system. They were simply one interface among many. And Claire had intersected with them at exactly the wrong point in the hierarchy. Varese looked again at her final message. Can we talk tonight? Now it no longer sounded like a request. It sounded like escalation. A final attempt to resolve a structural misunderstanding before enforcement. Which meant Claire may have believed she was negotiating with a person, when in reality, she was engaging with a system that did not negotiate. It processed. The missing time window before her recorded death suddenly reappeared in a new light. Not as a gap in evidence, but as a transition phase. A period where the system shifted from observation to execution. And during that phase, Claire had been inside a controlled environment designed to eliminate unpredictability, which explained the lack of struggle, the lack of panic, the clinical precision of her final condition. She had not been overpowered.
She had been resolved.
Varese closed his eyes briefly, then reopened them, forcing himself back into the data. Because one final inconsistency remained. The witness memory. The clean shoes. The stillness. The positioning. If the system was as controlled as it now appeared, then why allow a witness at all? Why leave any external observation point? Unless it was intentional.
A controlled leak.
A managed perception layer designed to ensure that any external narrative would stabilize around a specific interpretation. The man outside the building was not just confirming completion. He was shaping future understanding, which meant even the witness account was part of the structure. And if the witness account was part of the structure, then every step of Claire's case had been designed not only to end in her death, but to end in a specific story about her death. And that realization reframed everything one final time. Claire Dufour had not simply been killed inside a system. She had been used to preserve it. And now, 20 years later, that preservation was beginning to fail. Because someone inside the structure had miscalculated one variable. the investigator who refused to stop. The first sign of collapse in any controlled system is not noise. It is contradiction. Detective Laurent Varese felt it emerge slowly, like pressure building behind glass that had already been weakened by invisible stress fractures. The continuity oversight layer, if that was truly what he was dealing with, was not reacting faster anymore. It was reacting inconsistently. And inconsistency meant internal strain. Something inside the structure was no longer aligned. For the first time since he began reconstructing Claire Dufour's death, the resistance he encountered did not feel unified. It felt layered, competing, as if multiple hands were now adjusting the same mechanism without full coordination. That detail mattered more than anything else. Because systems designed for concealment survive on coherence. When coherence breaks, exposure begins. Varese sat in the dim light of his office, the entire case now reorganized into a single integrated model across his desk. Claire was no longer at the center as a victim. She was at the center as a trigger point, a localized failure that had propagated outward through a distributed structure built to remain invisible. But now the structure was visible. And visibility changes behavior. He returned once more to the continuity oversight layer.
It no longer felt abstract.
It felt operational. Not a group. Not an organization in the conventional sense. A protocol environment. A governance layer that existed through delegated actors, fragmented responsibilities, and compartmentalized awareness. No single individual inside it needed full understanding. Each participant only required partial visibility to perform their role. That was why it had survived so long. And that was why Claire's case had not been anticipated as a threat. Because she had not been supposed to unify fragments. Only consume them. But she had done more than consume. She had connected. And connection is always the first form of resistance. Varese shifted focus to Morel again, but now the man appeared different in the reconstructed structure. No longer a central figure. Not even a key operator. More like a stabilizing intermediary, someone ensuring that outputs from medical-adjacent processes remained within acceptable thresholds. A regulator of outcomes.
Not the source of them.
Which meant Morel himself might not have known the full scope of what he was stabilizing. That possibility changed the emotional geometry of the case. Because it introduced something more unsettling than malice. Function without awareness. The system did not require everyone inside it to understand what it was doing. Only to maintain its continuity. And Claire had disrupted that continuity by recognizing patterns that were never meant to be assembled into a whole. Varese opened her final communication logs again. The cafe message. The prepaid phone response. The brief network relay. But now he filtered them differently. Not as interactions. As synchronization checkpoints. Each event marked a transition in system state rather than personal decision-making. Claire's message had triggered acknowledgement. The response had triggered engagement. The movement to the apartment had triggered containment. And somewhere within that sequence, the system had shifted from passive monitoring to active resolution. But one anomaly still resisted full explanation. The timing drift in her recorded death. That inconsistency had never stabilized. Not even under reconstructed models. Which meant the system itself had failed to fully synchronize its own record of events. And that failure was the most dangerous signal yet. Because controlled systems can tolerate external uncertainty. They cannot tolerate internal disagreement. Varese leaned forward, isolating the forensic layer once again. Environmental conditions, temperature modeling, cellular activity, post-mortem estimation variance. All converged on a narrower window than previously accepted. But still not exact. Still fractured. Which meant there had been at least two overlapping interpretations of Claire's final moments. One physical. One procedural. And they did not align perfectly. That misalignment suggested interference at the moment of resolution. not from outside. From within the system itself. Someone had overwritten or adjusted the classification after the fact. Not to conceal the death, but to normalize it within acceptable parameters. Which meant the system had not acted as a single entity. It had corrected itself after execution. And correction implies oversight. He paused. Because that led directly back to the continuity oversight layer. Not as initiator, but as post-event stabilizer. A structure that did not execute actions, but ensured outcomes remained narratively and systemically consistent afterward. Which explained the witness. The man outside the building. The clean shoes. The positioning. The stillness. He had not been observing Claire's death. He had been verifying that the event matched its expected profile. A quality control function embedded in human observation. The implication was stark. Claire's death was not an anomaly within the system. It was a managed outcome that required verification at multiple levels. Physical. Digital. Behavioral. Narrative. And the witness was part of the narrative layer. Which meant every detail Varese had been reconstructing, including memory testimony, was not external to the system. It was embedded within it. He stood abruptly, moving toward the wall map again, but something had changed in his perception. The structure no longer felt like something he was uncovering. It felt like something he was entering. And that realization came with a subtle, but undeniable shift. The delays stopped. No new access restrictions.
No witness withdrawals. No procedural interference.
For the first time in days, the system was quiet. Too quiet. Because silence in controlled environments is rarely absence. It is preparation. He checked his secure communication line. A single incoming file had been delivered.
No sender. No routing metadata.
Just a document labeled Internal Continuity Review, Case Alignment Reference. He did not open it immediately. He understood what it represented. Acknowledgement. Not resistance. Engagement. The system had stopped trying to slow him down. It had begun responding to him directly. Which meant he had crossed a threshold where observation was no longer passive. He was now part of the feedback loop. Varese opened the file. Inside were structured references to multiple events matching Claire's classification profile, cardiac cessation cases, environmental anomalies, procedural consolidations. Each one listed with internal tags identical to those he had reconstructed independently. But the most important section was not the list. It was the header. Stabilization Integrity Review. Observer convergence detected. Observer convergence. 2 words that redefined everything. Because they implied that multiple independent investigative trajectories had been tracked simultaneously across time. And now they had converged. On him. Varese felt something cold settle in his understanding. He was not the first to reconstruct the system. He was the first to reach coherence inside it. And coherence triggers response. The file continued. Recommend protocol adjustment. Narrative containment assessment pending. Narrative containment. Not investigation suppression. Not evidence control. Narrative control. Which confirmed the final truth he had been approaching without naming it. This system did not exist only to manage outcomes. It existed to manage understanding. And Claire Dufour's death had not just been an event. It had been a narrative anchor point. A controlled story designed to stabilize perception across multiple layers of unseen infrastructure. But something had gone wrong. Because now the narrative was unstable. And he was the source of instability. The witness was no longer outside the structure. Neither was Morel. Neither was Claire. They were all components inside a system that had begun to recognize its own exposure through him. Varese closed the file slowly. Not out of fear, but recognition. Because now the investigation had completed its transition. He was no longer reconstructing the past. He was interacting with an active system that still believed the past required protection. And that meant the final phase was not discovery. It was resolution. Somewhere in Paris, in layers beneath official records, beneath abandoned facilities, beneath financial abstractions and erased identities, something was now recalibrating its internal boundaries. Not to hide Claire Dufour's death, but to decide what to do with the fact that someone had understood it. And for the first time since 2003, the cold case was no longer cold. It was awake. Awake systems do not announce themselves. They adjust. Quietly, precisely, like a breath being taken in a room that has already been sealed. Detective Laurent Varese felt at the moment he stepped into the station that morning. Nothing had changed on the surface. Same corridors. Same fluorescent hum. Same distant movement of clerks and officers moving through routine cases that still believed they were separate from everything else. But nothing felt separate anymore. The continuity oversight layer was no longer a hypothesis on a map of fragmented evidence. It had become a presence without shape, expressed through timing, through absence, through alignment, and now through attention. Because the file on his desk was no longer just information. It was a response. He did not open it immediately. He already understood what it represented. The previous document had marked convergence detection. This one was not escalation. It was classification completion. A system does not escalate indefinitely. At a certain point, it resolves. And resolution in structures like this does not mean truth. It means containment of truth. Varese finally opened the file. The first page was minimal, clinical, devoid of narrative language. Only structured entries, timestamps, and alignment markers. But what mattered was not what was written. It was what had been standardized. Claire Dufour's case was no longer listed as an anomaly. It was now categorized under a broader classification cluster. Cardiac Outcome Integrity Series, Phase 3 Stabilization Events. Multiple cases, multiple years, multiple locations. All normalized under a single internal framework. And at the bottom of the page, a note. Observer integration detected. Adjustment protocol initiated. Not investigation suppression. Adjustment. That word carried weight because it implied adaptation rather than reaction. The system was not trying to stop him anymore.
It was trying to incorporate him.
Varese closed the file slowly, the realization settling into something colder than certainty. He was no longer external to the structure. He had become a variable within it. And variables must be accounted for. He looked at Claire's reconstructed timeline one final time. The cafe, the message, the prepaid response, the apartment, the environmental manipulation, the controlled cardiac cessation, the witness observation layer, the post-event stabilization. Every component now aligned into a single operational architecture. But something remained unresolved. Not in the evidence. In the intention. Why had Claire mattered enough to trigger structural adjustment after 20 years? That question had followed him from the beginning, but now it returned with sharper edges. Because systems like this do not destabilize over isolated events. They destabilize when an event connects to something larger. Claire had not been important because she died. She had been important because of what she had accessed. And more importantly, what she had almost reconstructed. The unfinished report, the fragmented trial data, the translation work tied to medical regulatory structures, the repeated exposure to layer documentation that was never meant to converge. She had not simply been exposed to the system. She had been assembling it unknowingly. And that made her death, not just containment. It made it interruption. But interruption is never the end of a controlled system. It is the beginning of correction. Varese stood, moving to the window. Paris stretched beneath him, indifferent as always. The city that swallowed secrets not by hiding them, but by dispersing them until they no longer felt connected to anything real. But he could see them now. Not as events. As structure. And structures always leave traces in how they behave under observation. Behind him, his computer chimed once. A final incoming transmission.
No sendera identificación. No routing metadata.
Just a single line of text. Alignment complete. Narrative stability restored. And below it, observer classification. Integrated. He stared at it for a long moment. There was no threat in the message. No warning. No demand. Only confirmation. The system had finished adjusting around him, which meant the case was no longer being investigated. It was being contained through inclusion. Not silence. Not erasure. Absorption. Varese understood then what had actually happened across all these years. Claire Dufour had not been the center of the system. She had been a calibration point. A controlled event used to maintain balance within a distributed structure that managed outcomes beyond official awareness. And when she became unstable, when her case began to reassemble itself through unintended exposure, the system had responded not by correcting the past, but by correcting the present interpretation of the past, including him. The witness had been part of that correction layer. Morel had been part of its operational interface. The facility had been part of its historical infrastructure. But the continuity oversight layer was something else entirely. It was not a group. Not a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It was a persistence mechanism. A way of ensuring that certain outcomes remained functionally indistinguishable from natural events, regardless of how much scrutiny they received later. And Claire had disrupted that indistinguishability, which meant the system had one final requirement. Stability must be reestablished. Not through removal, but through closure. Varese returned to his desk and opened the case file one last time. He wrote nothing new, added nothing, requested nothing, because there was nothing left to extract. Only acknowledgement remained. Claire Dufour, 2003. Death classified, reclassified, stabilized, integrated into systemic continuity frameworks that existed beyond institutional language. A cold case, not because it was unsolved, but because it had been resolved in a language no official record was ever meant to translate. He closed the file. And in doing so, he understood the final truth of all of it. He had not solved the case. He had completed it. And completion, in systems like this, does not end exposure. It reassigns it. Somewhere beyond the administrative layers of Paris policing, beyond archives and medical records and financial ghosts, the structure that had contained Claire Dufour's death continued to operate. Not louder. Not visible. Just consistent. Maintaining alignment. Correcting drift. Ensuring that what had once been exposed remained indistinguishable from everything else. And as Detective Laurent Varese stepped out into the Paris morning, he was no longer looking for answers. Because answers had already been processed. What remained now was continuity.